In November 1998, a British science journal published 7 pages of DNA data that ended a 200-year argument. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, had fathered children with an enslaved woman he legally owned. The DNA said so. Within 2 years, the museum at Monticello rewrote its exhibits. Historians who had spent careers calling it folklore had to walk back their words in print. It was one of the most stunning reversals in American historical memory. And 100 miles away, in a small Virginia town called Gum Springs, a black family watched all of this happen and felt something they could not quite put into words, because they had been telling almost the exact same story for just as long. About the same era, about the same kind of man, about the same kind of relationship between power and an enslaved woman who had no power at all. Their ancestor was a man named West Ford, and according to every generation of his descendants, going back to the very beginning, his mother told anyone who asked that his father was, in her own words, the old general. Not a servant, not a field hand, not an overseer. The general. The title that in that household belonged to one man, George Washington, the face on the dollar bill, the father of the country, the man whose image is right now being stamped onto a new quarter for America's 250th birthday. And in 2026, West Ford's family is still waiting for the same thing the Hemings family got in 1998. A test, an answer, a moment where an institution looks at the evidence and decides that a 200-year-old family memory deserves the dignity of science. They have been formally asking since 1997. Nobody has said yes. Let us go back to the beginning. West Ford was born around 1784, though even that date is disputed. Mount Vernon's own historians do not fully agree on it. One part of their official record places his birth between March 1783 and June 1784. Another section of the same institution's materials simply states 1784. A newspaper investigation in the 1990s found evidence pointing as late as 1785. The date has never been definitively settled. His mother was a woman named Venus, classified in the records of the time as mulatto, the language of an era that created precise categories for people it refused to treat as fully human. Venus was not enslaved at Mount Vernon. She was enslaved at Bushfield Plantation, roughly 60 miles away, the property of George Washington's younger brother, John Augustine Washington, and his wife, Hannah. This is the strongest part of the case against George Washington's paternity. The calendar is not kind to the claim, and yet the story did not die. It did not fade. It did not drift or change or become something different with each generation. It stayed exactly the same for over 2 centuries. An enslaved woman named Venus told Hannah Washington directly who had fathered her son. She used a specific title, the Old General, and her descendants never stopped repeating it. Now here is the part of this story that most other tellings get slightly wrong. West Ford did not move to Mount Vernon under George Washington. Washington had already been dead for 3 years by the time West Ford arrived in 1802. He came with Bushrod Washington, George's nephew, the son of that same brother, John Augustine, who had inherited Mount Vernon after Martha Washington's death that same year. It was Bushrod who gave Ford a managerial position, supervising the estate's enslaved workers and greeting the thousands of visitors who traveled to see Washington's home and tomb. It was Bushrod's mother, Hannah, whose will freed Ford at age 21 in 1805. And it was Bushrod's own will in 1829 that handed Ford 119 acres of land on Hunting Creek, with a specific request that he be kept on the payroll. In 1998, when DNA settled the Jefferson question, it worked through Y-chromosome testing. The Y-chromosome passes virtually unchanged from father to son through generations. Scientists tested male line descendants of Thomas Jefferson and compared them to male line descendants of Sally Hemings' son, Eston. The result was a match to the Jefferson male line. The method worked cleanly in that case because Jefferson's proposed alternative suspects, his nephews the Carr brothers, were on a completely different Y-chromosome line and could be excluded. West Ford's case does not have that luxury. George Washington and Bushrod Washington share the same Y-chromosome. They are on the same male line. A DNA test that shows West Ford's descendants carry Washington Y-chromosome DNA cannot tell you which Washington. It cannot separate the president from the president's nephew. The same test that proved the Jefferson connection would produce only a partial answer here. It could confirm Washington lineage, but could never confirm which Washington man was the father. Mount Vernon itself has stated clearly that a Y-chromosome test can only determine whether someone belongs to the Washington male line, not to a specific individual, and therefore could not prove George Washington's paternity specifically. Family tree, DNA. This is not a minor technical detail. This is the fundamental reason the case cannot have a clean 1998 moment, even if Mount Vernon agreed to cooperate tomorrow. The genetic architecture of this family makes a definitive answer through Y-chromosome testing essentially impossible with current methods. But here's where the story in 2026 becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because something happened in 2024 that nobody in this debate has fully reckoned with yet. A research team from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, working with family tree DNA, successfully identified the remains of George Washington's own relatives from unmarked graves at the Harewood Estate in West Virginia. Researchers had excavated 5 unmarked graves at the cemetery in 1999, recovering small bones and teeth from 3 burials. But DNA testing at the time was inconclusive, with the samples badly degraded and contaminated with bacteria. The new 2024 study used methods that had advanced dramatically since those early tests. The new DNA analysis certified 3 sets of identities from the site. 2 of the individuals were George Washington's grandnephews, George Steptoe Washington and Samuel Walter Washington, and another set of bones belonged to their mother, Lucy Payne Washington, Westford legacy M.M. von Thamove. The technology used in that 2024 study did not rely on Y-chromosome matching alone. All 3 types of DNA were used: Y-chromosome, mitochondrial DNA, and autosomal DNA, allowing researchers to determine identities and family relationships in ways that single marker testing cannot. Modern autosomal DNA analysis can establish the degree of relatedness between individuals across multiple family lines simultaneously. It can distinguish between uncle and nephew. It can tell you whether 2 people share the genetic signature of a grandparent. It operates at a level of resolution that the 1998 Jefferson test could not approach. Baltimore Sun. In other words, the technology that could potentially provide a more nuanced answer in the Westford case, the technology that might be able to distinguish between George Washington and Bushrod Washington as a father, either exists today or is approaching rapidly. And the same institution that controls George Washington's archived hair samples, the same institution that controls the burial ground where Westford's remains are believed to lie, has given no indication that it intends to revisit its position. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association has stated that the FBI analyzed samples of hair identified as Washington's from Mount Vernon and 4 other institutions in 1994. The Bureau's report stated that very little, if any, DNA was detected in the samples, too degraded and too fragmented after more than 2 centuries to answer anything. That test was conducted 30 years ago using 1994 technology. The same technology that failed to identify those Harewood graves in 1999 was later superseded by methods precise enough to succeed in 2024. Nobody has retested Washington's hair samples using modern techniques. Nobody has publicly proposed doing so. The samples sit in archives, while the science that might finally be able to read them has transformed beyond recognition. Family tree DNA. Now, let us look honestly at the strongest version of the case for George Washington's paternity, because this story deserves intellectual honesty on both sides. Start with the pattern of favor. Whether it ultimately traces to George or to Bushrod, someone in the Washington family treated Westford with a level of provision that was almost never extended to an enslaved child in early American history. Guaranteed manumission at a specific age, written into a formal legal document. A commissioned portrait to mark the moment of freedom. An object so rare that most freed people from that era left no image of themselves at all. A permanent managerial position at the most symbolically significant private estate in the country. And then outright land ownership. Over 100 acres, enough to build a town on. That is not how Virginia, in the early 1800s, typically treated the children of ordinary enslaved women. That is how families, even ones unwilling to say so in writing, sometimes treated their own blood. Then there is the consistency of the oral tradition itself. Unlike rumors that grow and shift with each retelling, the Ford family's account has stayed remarkably stable across 200 years. Venus naming the old general. Westford's personal closeness to Washington as a boy. The specific details repeated by Westford's grandson in a 1937 Illinois newspaper interview, again confirmed in his 1939 obituary. The same account passed down through the family's official chronicler to the present day. Family oral history that changes to fit each generation's political or social needs is a warning sign. Family oral history that stays this consistent, with this level of specific detail, for 2 centuries is the opposite of that. When the Jefferson DNA results came back in 1998, they did not actually prove Thomas Jefferson himself was the father with mathematical certainty. The Y-chromosome match proved only that someone in Jefferson's male line had fathered Eston Hemings. It required the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's own historians, weighing letters, timelines, travel records, and the testimony across generations, to conclude that Jefferson specifically was the most probable father. They chose to follow the evidence where it led. They updated the exhibits. They changed the official story. They let the evidence do its work. Mount Vernon has made the opposite choice. Faced with a family oral tradition just as old, just as consistent, and arguably better evidenced in its physical traces, the institution has issued what amounts to a flat denial, not unproven, not under investigation, not something we are still examining with new tools. According to Mount Vernon's own leadership, Washington was not anyone's father. That is a statement of fact built on the absence of paperwork. Paperwork that an enslaved woman in 1783 Virginia was never in a position to generate in the first place. Enslaved women could not write wills. Their children were not listed as sons in family Bibles. The documentation that Mount Vernon says is missing was never something Venus was legally or socially permitted to create. That is not a gap in the historical record. That is the historical record operating exactly as the system that produced it was designed to operate. According to Mount Vernon's own documented history, George and Martha Washington's remains, along with other Washington family members, were moved out of that old vault in 1831 into a newly constructed tomb nearby. The old vault has been documented as empty since 1831, over 30 years before Westford himself died in 1863. Photographs from a major restoration of the vault in 1938, 60 years before Hollis made her request, already show it standing empty. The tomb was not secretly cleared in 1998. It had been documented as empty since before the Civil War. But here is what is actually strange, and what almost nobody asks. If the old tomb had been empty and unused as a Washington family burial site since 1831, and if Westford's family tradition holds that he was placed there, what does that mean for where his body actually is? Mount Vernon has no burial record for Westford anywhere, not in that vault, not in any other documented location. They kept burial records for dozens of other enslaved and formerly enslaved people connected to the estate. Westford, the man who managed the estate, guarded the president's tomb, founded a town, and received 119 acres of land in a formal will, has no burial record. Mount Vernon's best guess is that he was buried in the estate's enslaved burial ground, an unmarked plot that holds an estimated 50 to 75 other people whose names history also never recorded. Mount Vernon has stated it will not excavate that ground for any purpose, out of respect for all who are buried there. That is a genuinely defensible ethical position about a sacred site. It is also, functionally, the position that forecloses the last physical path to any DNA answer from Westford's own remains. The vault is empty. The hair samples are degraded by 1994 standards. The burial ground will not be excavated. Every physical door that might lead to an answer has quietly closed one by one. Meanwhile, 250 years after the founding of the nation, George Washington's face is being stamped onto a new commemorative quarter. He is called the father of his country on every page of every American history textbook. His home at Mount Vernon attracts over 1 million visitors a year. The institution that controls his archives, his hair samples, his burial sites, and the only ground that might still contain a DNA answer, has decided, on behalf of all of us, which memories count as history and which ones get classified as folklore. And the Ford family, a family that built one of the oldest free black communities in America, a family whose members stood guard over the president's grave for 3 generations, a family that has said the same specific thing for over 200 years, is still waiting for someone to treat their memory with the same scientific seriousness that another family's memory received in a British lab in 1998. Here is what makes this story land differently in 2026. We live in a moment of genuinely revolutionary genetic technology. DNA analysis has come a long way since the early 2000s. The same science that successfully identified George Washington's relatives from century-old degraded bones in unmarked West Virginia graves in 2024 is the same science that has not been turned on this question. Advanced autosomal DNA analysis, the kind that goes beyond Y-chromosome matching to map relationships across multiple family lines simultaneously, is now robust enough to potentially distinguish between a father and a nephew even when they share the same patrilineal signature. It is not guaranteed. It is not certain. But the technology that might narrow this question down significantly exists right now, and the decision not to apply it is a choice being made by a specific institution, renewed every year while the Ford family waits. Westford legacy. The Jefferson case taught America something important. 200 years of institutional dismissal is not the same as 200 years of evidence against a claim. Oral tradition passed consistently across generations is not the same as rumor. In the absence of paperwork in a system that deliberately excluded the people making the claim from creating paperwork is not the same as absence of truth. The Hemings family knew what it knew. The historical establishment told them they were wrong for 2 centuries. The DNA said the family was right. The machine that produced that answer in 1998 has only gotten more powerful and more precise in the 28 years since. Westford's family knows what it knows. They have known it for over 200 years. They have a portrait commissioned at the moment of freedom. They have 3 generations of tomb guardians. They have a land grant generous enough to build a town. They have an oral tradition that has never wavered. They have a 2024 DNA study that mapped Washington family genetics using bones far older and more degraded than anything in the Gum Springs burial ground. And they have a question that, in the year of America's 250th birthday, still does not have an answer. Not because the science cannot find one, but because the institution that controls the evidence has decided it would rather not look. George Washington insisted for the whole of his life that he would leave no children behind him. Westford's descendants have insisted for over 200 years that he already had. Between those two claims sits a question that modern DNA technology is closer to answering than it has ever been. The only thing missing is the will to ask it. And that is not a scientific problem. That is a choice, renewed every year, made by people, about which families' memories this country decides to take seriously.